All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We check into great all-encompassing or grand unifying or earth-shattering theories and discoveries that are so obscure that you probably haven't heard of them before. Maybe emerging ideas. As in this case, this is our 227th Bible Decode, focusing on the New Testament, and in particular, the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the Romans, the Caesars, are the party who wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done fighting the Jews in a war, which was the culmination of many insurrections and riots and revolutions and uprisings and revolts that had been going on in Judea for the last 130 years. All the way from when the Romans pulled in and took over in Judea in 63 BC up until this War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And two of the primary generals in that war for the Romans were General Vespasian and his son, General Titus. And they both were wounded in that war, and they both eventually became emperor. Vespasian from 69 to 79, and Titus from 79 to 81. And his younger brother Domitian also from 81 to 96. That's the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, and they are the ones who wrote the New Testament, backdated the story by over 40 years. And they did so basically in order to mellow out the Jews, to tame or domesticate or prune the Jews. Also to graft their Roman Caesars, graft the Roman Caesars onto the Jewish tradition. And they did this by writing the Gospels and portraying a Jewish Messiah. Now keep in mind that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah from all of the Old Testament prophecies that pointed to such a Jewish Messiah who was going to come and lead the Israelites out of bondage, out of, in this particular case, to kick out the Romans. And that's exactly what happened in 66 AD. Three self-proclaimed, maybe more than three self-proclaimed messiahs rose up, and they kicked out Herod Agrippa II, who was the Herod puppet king of Judea appointed by the Romans. Sent him back to Rome, and that's what Emperor Nero then decided to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. It took 7 long years. Halfway through, Vespasian became the new emperor, and he appointed Titus. But the main point is that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and so after the war, even though the Romans triumphed, they knew that the Jews were coming back at some point. And so they wrote this story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace instead, who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile for the Romans, carrying their pack and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the same time being intentionally disruptive to the Jewish rituals, especially the animal sacrifice at the temple, that they needed money changers for, and vendors to sell small animals. And that's what Jesus went after. And if you read the Gospels, then you will also recognize that Paul even does this in a more pronounced manner, where he is very pro-Roman or deferential to the Romans while being rather anti-Jew. So both Paul and Jesus behave just as if they were written by the Romans. But there's a lot more proof than that. You hear the motive. Well, what they really did is they wrote the New Testament, and at the same time they wrote another book, 7 volumes of a history of this war between the Jews and the Romans, called War of the Jews, or the Jewish War. And they wrote that under the name of Josephus. Josephus was an insider to the Flavian court at Caesar's palace in Rome under the Flavians, and that's where he lived, I believe, the rest of his days, even if he is a real person. I kind of think he's kind of like a team of people. But regardless, he is an agent of the Romans, and he wrote Jewish War. And if you read Jewish War alongside the New Testament, with an eye of knowing what you're looking for, you will see undeniable patterns between the two works. One is parodying the other, and then the other parodies it back. They sometimes have kind of little conversations. There are just so many different parallels that Michael Menescotts actually went into the book of Luke looking for parallels and found over 250 of them just in the book of Luke, which is more than one every 5 verses. And many of the parallels last for 5 verses or longer. So the book of Luke is just saturated with parallels. Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, also found a series of parallels between the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea and the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. They go to the same places in the same order and involve themselves in the same type of events, parallel events that are spaced by 40 years. And also many of the prophecies that are given by Jesus in the New Testament are literally fulfilled in the words of Josephus's War of the Jews. In particular, the prophecy that Jesus makes about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which is brought about by General Titus in the War of the Jews. Titus, now this is what Jesus says is the marker of his second coming. So this makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. And that's how the Romans were able to try to graft themselves onto the Jewish tradition. Many, many other families of parallels are involved. Then we also have the motive. We got the motive, the MO, the method. The Romans had created a number of other religions in the first century, including rabbinical Judaism, which is kind of a parallel with this in the first century. They use psychological operations in all kinds of different circumstances. And they were also very big on wordplay, enigmas, name swapping, aliases, codes, and a lot of wordplay, switching languages, and so on and so forth. This was a literal entertainment for them. And so it's very easy to see what they were doing when you look at the New Testament and War of the Jews at the same time. When Michael Menescotz found those 250 plus parallels just in the book of Luke, he also, for kicks, just decided to graph them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Not like he just did it for kicks. He followed a clue that's in, I believe it's in Luke chapter 10, that kind of gave him an intuition to map this out. And by plotting all 250 plus points, he formed 5 near perfect letters of the same size in Latin. APTVS or APTUS. The TVS would be Titus Vespasian. But the main idea is that the Romans literally put their initials on the book of Luke. Now, we have been also examining some other works that are kind of adjacent to see how the explanatory power of the Roman origins hypothesis, I think, is really incredible. As a matter of fact, it seems to be able to explain all comers as far as first century history and mystery is concerned. And really answering all the questions that we didn't really understand about the New Testament. So now we're looking at a book that stopped short of the Roman origins hypothesis, but they definitely understood that there was some kind of Roman origin involved. But they didn't go all the way to thinking that the Romans wrote the whole New Testament, but just that the Romans were the originators of Saul or Paul, that Paul was a Roman agent or an undercover agent working for the Romans, a spy for the Romans, and that, you know, his conversion calling experience on the road to Damascus was really like a false flag that gave him the cover to try to infiltrate the Nazarene movement of, you know, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and to try to infiltrate this movement in the years after Jesus' crucifixion. Now, they don't stretch it far enough to recognize that Jesus is a character in the same vein as Paul, an instrument of the Romans to say good things about the Romans, never say bad things about the Romans, but to denigrate the Jews. And the Romans were masters of this kind of stuff. It's like, if you kind of know how to decode this stuff, many of the decodes are literally dripping with hate for the Jews and just ridicule, mockery, and just mean-spiritedness toward the Jews. Now, sometimes the Jews got back at them. Some of the Talmud, which is what rabbinical Judaism started there at Jabneh in Judea in the late first century, about the same time as Christianity was written. And this guy named Yohanan ben Zakkai was basically a tool of the Flavians. And he started this kind of a college for the Jewish study of the scriptures. And this was another psychological operation that the Jews used to try to kind of divert the attention of the Jews, get them into the, you know, everlasting going over details of the scripture, you know, digging in deeper and deeper to this, you know, various, you know, ways that they use words and digging into the kind of esoteric meaning of the scripture while, diverting them from any type of political uprising, which is what, the Romans wanted to get rid of. You do have to remember that the Romans, it's a limited hangout. There's a lot of very good stuff, wholesome stuff in the Bible, in the New Testament. None of it is really very original. It's all derived from other sources, such as Seneca and some other Roman Stoics, and Plato, and some other Greek Platonists, and Egyptian philosophy, Persian philosophy, Zoroastrianism, and Sumerian stuff, a lot of pagan stuff. The Jews, the Romans, they wanted you to be a good citizen. They wanted you to be honest and hardworking. And, so, there's a lot of stuff that you can really grasp onto in the New Testament. And that's pretty much what Christians do. Most of them is they kind of cherry pick verses. There's a few hundred really powerful and useful for life verses in the New Testament that they cite all the time. But what they need to do is really do the dig on the New Testament. Who wrote it, where, from where, how, and for what reason. But a lot of them look at it as if it's the Word of God, and then so they don't question it. They just assume that it's telling honest history or something. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's pure 100% propaganda. And the Romans left the clues so that you could discover this. So anyway, now we're looking at a book called Operation Messiah, written by Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon. And this book posits that Paul is an agent of the Romans and trying to, infiltrate the Nazarene movement. So we're at a section here in chapter 7, I believe, called Against Whom Was Paul Working? We know Paul's opponents within the Jesus movement undertook an active mission against him. They followed him from place to place, trying to undo his preaching. They attacked his credentials as a Jew. They pointed to his earlier work as a persecutor. They questioned his conversion story. And they tried to undermine his preaching in any way possible. They were somewhat successful, since his letters, especially Galatians, Philippians, and 2 Corinthians, are Paul's bitter counterattack against anti-Pauline Jewish apostles within the Jesus movement. Paul preached against dogs, evil workers, false brethren, and certain men from James. Now, I wish I could remember. I'll have to look it up. There are 13 epistles of Paul, but about 6 of them are disputed as to whether they're really from Paul or written by some later person influenced by Paul. And I believe 2 Corinthians is one of the ones that's disputed. I don't know. I think Philippians is legit, and Galatians I can't remember. So anyway, he's pointing those out as being amongst his most bitter counterattack works against the Nazarenes, It was axiomatic for some scholars that Paul's opponents in Galatia were the emissaries of the Nazarenes, operating under the auspices of Peter and James. To the ordinary diaspora Jews, comfortably settled and tolerated in their religion by the Roman authorities, Paul was a dangerous troublemaker. It was for this reason that Paul was thrown out of their cities, beaten and frequently imprisoned. That is, if things actually happened and are not a dramatization of existing tensions meant to arouse sympathy for Paul. The Jews in the diaspora objected to Paul for political reasons. As far as they were concerned, the Jesus movement was a resistance movement against the Romans, both pious and extremist. They did not know enough about the internal politics of this movement to distinguish Paul from its other leading figures. The opposition Paul met with from Jews on his travels was therefore not based on hearsay or apostasy, but on the political grounds that Paul, like many Nazarenes from Jerusalem, was stirring up trouble with the Roman Empire and thus endangering their comfortable settlements in the Jewish diaspora. This is explicitly stated by the Jews of Thessalonica, who denounced Paul to the local magistrates in those terms. The men who have made trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has harbored them. They all flout the emperor's laws and assert that there is a rival king, Jesus. That's in Acts 17:6. Jason was being charged with harboring seditionists. On the other hand, to Nazarenes and other militant messianists, Paul was dangerous because he was not simply preaching pious Judaism with the belief in Jesus as a Messiah figure thrown in. He was inventing an entirely different approach to Jesus. The Roman government would have wanted to know what was going on inside those cultural and religious Jewish islands, especially in times of political unrest in Palestine. After all, these Jewish enclaves were home to a people who had a history of fighting domination by foreigners and whose homeland had always been a hotbed of resistance against Roman rule. Judea had not been under Roman control for very long, and most Jews had not grown accustomed to Roman rule. It had been over 100 years. Anyway, some Jews were actively trying to change the political status quo in their homeland. When these rebels were persecuted, some of them fled from Palestine to places such as Damascus, Antioch, Cyprus, and Phoenicia. For the Roman government, it would then be logical to conclude that these Jews might also flee to other destinations inside the empire, hiding within Jewish communities. What could a government whose hands were tied by an imperial decree giving the Jews religious freedom do to measure the political temperature of those Jewish communities? It seems that clandestine operations would have been the only option, either by recruiting informers or by planting one or more agents inside those communities. If anti-Roman messianism was rampant in Palestine, which it was, and if those messianists were willing to flee to avoid being arrested by the authorities, which they were, it would have been advisable for the Roman government to find messianists hiding out in various Jewish communities in other parts of the empire. The search would have included Jewish radicals of other kinds, active or in hiding, in those communities. Paul was a good candidate for such a mission. His persecution mission to Damascus had already shown the authorities that he was willing and able to travel extensively as part of his efforts to fight the movement. Okay, so this section is called Paul on the Road. Although the details in Acts may be highly disputed, the journeys Paul took may still be accepted in broad outline. It may very well be that Paul undertook some of the journeys Acts mentions, and also that the locations to which Acts refers are indeed the places to which Paul might have gone. Acts was giving its readership a religious explanation for these journeys, which may have been the subject of spreading stories and rumors suggesting they were undertaken for completely different reasons, never mentioned by Acts. The Orthodox interpretation of Paul's life assumes that the purpose of these travels was to spread his religious message by starting or visiting Christian communities throughout the empire. Could it be that his religious agenda was intertwined with a Roman political agenda? Or maybe the Romans just made him up entirely, and so it wasn't even intertwined, it was the exact same. It seems difficult to believe that a sincere apostle would flaunt his Roman citizenship or spend his entire career in the centers of Roman power, consorting with Roman officials and preaching a message that benefited Rome. We may take it for granted that the areas in which he worked were chosen by him on purpose, not randomly. He could have spread his universal message of God anywhere, but for some reason he focused on the areas covered in Acts. Two possible explanations for his choice of region seem to suggest themselves. One, Roman protection. During his travels, Paul needed and always received protection from his Jewish enemies. Paul's explanation of himself as a persecutor turned saint was a flimsy cover for a Roman undercover operator. Security was a good reason for Paul to stay close to the Roman authorities. And the second is Jewish audience. If Paul was a provocateur sent out to work against the Nazarenes, they probably would have suspected him. His message and his actions provoked violent reactions from them everywhere he went. Paul's exploits work well as the itinerary of an agent provocateur. He traveled for the same reasons that a true apostle might, namely to check up on communities, get the political and religious temperature at certain locations, and influence the minds of those present. A pointer to the possibility that he was more concerned with keeping a finger on the movement's pulse and self-preservation rather than with spreading new religious doctrines is that Paul reacted only to practical issues that arose in some communities. He did not draft a general outline of his religious convictions. It could be argued that if spreading his religious convictions had been his true vocation, he would have gone to many more places to secure this end. He would have written many more letters, or a general work of theology of some sort, which he could have copied and sent off to various communities. For example, if his relationship with the Roman authorities was as good as Acts describes, why not recruit more heavily among the powers that be? If you are a real apostle to the Gentiles, why go to synagogues at all? If you have access to the Romans, why not continue to convert top officials and thus create a safe context for the rest of your preaching and that of others? If you have their ear, why not convince the Roman authorities to drop their persecution efforts altogether? He never makes this request anywhere in Acts. Also, it seems likely that he would have been more concerned with Jesus' career, which he was not. Paul's inconsistency throughout his career is not something normally associated with a sincere, religiously inspired apostle. Rather, it fits the profile of an agent provocateur, who did not care as much for consistency as he did for controversy. This might explain the numerous contradictions in his life and work. Paul is generally known as the apostle to the Gentiles. Why would an agent provocateur address non-Jewish followers if the Roman authorities mainly had a problem with the Jewish core of the Messianist movement. There are several possible reasons, which he gives 3. 1, to counter the tendency for non-Jews to join Jews in their religious and ethical practices, which were isolated from the rest of Roman society. 2, possibly to make sure that non-Jews were not susceptible to the revolutionary message that the original movement or any other Jewish movement was spreading. 3, to counter Jewish proselytizing, which the Roman government opposed. It seems quite possible that resistance against Roman rule was not solely restricted to Palestine, but that discontent was brewing in other areas as well. The true Messianist message proclaimed that the end was near and that it would usher in a new world order. Whether headed by a Jewish king Messiah or not, it was a popular vision in non-Jewish circles. If Paul's goal was to influence the Messianist communities and track down possible members of the original Jesus movement and other Jewish radicals, he had good reason to travel, whether as an agent or a true apostle. Targeting dissatisfied non-Jews may also have been part of his duties. In an historical context, it could be argued that psychological warfare of the kind that Saul may have engaged in under the name of Paul was perhaps the only way to fight those Jews who were not easily fazed by other methods. See, they make a point there that the point would be much more applicable with the Roman origins hypothesis. You know, they understand that this is psychological warfare that Paul is engaging in, but they do not recognize that it's way more systematic than that. It's not just Paul and some few Roman officials. It's the entire New Testament that is the psychological warfare. Okay, let's see here. We'll try a couple more paragraphs if possible. Even though Paul is generally known as the apostle to the Gentiles, it must be kept in mind that during his journeys, Paul made a point of visiting Jewish synagogues first, as we have outlined. His dealings with non-Jews always came